Hola, and welcome to Vive Nutrition Radio, the first ever Spanglish podcast where you will hear interviews with the top minds in nutrition, performance, fitness, and health in both English and Spanish. Here is your host, expert registered dietitian, Andres Ayesta, on a mission to help you take your nutrition to the next level. Hope you're ready for this. Let's dive right in.
Hey guys, this is Andres, Vive Nutrition Radio. We're going to start calling it VNR. Thank you so much for being with us today. One of the things that we've talked about in previous episodes is the importance of not just only looking at nutrition from the food perspective and just what you eat, but just the effect that nutrition can have or impact how our body is working or its physiology. One of the things that a lot of times people don't understand to a greater extent is going to be hormones and hormone optimization. If you listened in to, I think it was episode number 10, when we talked to Joanne Keller, we dove deep into specifically sexual hormones and the impact and the effect that they can have in how your body is reacting or responding to either training or your nutrition when you're trying to achieve a specific goal, whether it is weight gain or weight loss. So today I wanted to expand more on that, and I wanted to bring in somebody that applies it from the nutrition and fitness perspective on a daily basis, and his name is Sam Miller. He is the owner of Oracle Training and Nutrition. He's going to tell you a little bit about more Oracle and where that kind of started, but Sam is a smart cookie. He's obtained numerous certifications throughout his career from ISSA. He's also a precision nutrition coach, and he's really interested, like since he was very young, into the sports of not only bodybuilding but also on nutrition. And he's seen both sides of the spectrum when it comes to down to health and physique development, from being the not so fit person, chubby teenager, so obviously, and he's going to tell you a little bit about that story, to also being an underweight 130 pound college kid who's scraped and scienced his way to becoming a national qualified physique competitor and a coach in the fitness industry. So he's come a long way, and he's here not only to share his expertise, but also to share his history and where he came from. He has a bachelor's in science from Illinois University, and he actually obtained his master's degree from North Carolina State University in 2014. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Sam. We dive deep into specific topics within hormone optimization and also what he usually does when he's conducting sessions with his clients. Without further ado, here is our conversation with Sam Miller. What's up, guys? Welcome back to Vive Nutrition Radio. As I said in the introduction, we have the pleasure to have Sam Miller. He is an awesome nutrition coach and also fitness professional, and we became really good friends through Instagram. And I have the pleasure to have him here today for him to share his knowledge and to delight us with a lot of the information that he can give out. So, Sam, welcome to the show, man. How are you?
I'm doing good. Thank you for having me. It's always nice to, as we were talking about, kind of expand our social connections through Instagram. And I know that's how we started chatting. And I've enjoyed kind of going back and forth with you ever since we started.
Yeah, man. And I'm definitely excited to talk about some of the things that we're going to dive into today. But I feel like we can probably start from the beginning. And I'm always interested to talk to fitness and nutrition professionals on kind of like their start. And I think I've written somewhere in there that you kind of went from like different extremes, from, like being overweight to being a complete physique competitor and kind of trying to find some balance in between that throughout your entire either I guess youth and also going into college. So how did that start? And what led you to come to become what you are here today?
Definitely. So I appreciate that. So starting from the beginning, my fitness journey for me started probably towards the end of high school. I think a lot of guys, usually that's when you might get into lifting weights for sports or just trying to improve body composition. Every teenage guy wants biceps and chest and abs. So for me, I wouldn't say I was never like super obese. I was definitely on the chubbier side, probably in my earlier teens, and not super healthy. I mean, I was probably the kid playing Madden 2003 and eating 3D Doritos on a beanbag chair, just kind of hanging out and not really understanding the mechanisms of health. So for me, my journey started probably towards the end of high school and into college. I began lifting weights and reading things like Men's Health or T Nation or bodybuilding.com, just really whatever I could get my hands on to start consuming information. And that's when I realized that there was a lot of conflicting information out there. I'd read an article and then the next week I'd read another article and it would contradict what I read the previous week. And so I started on this quest to essentially piece together reliable sources of information. And that's something that my company tries to stand for today, is really just to serve our clients and translate the most complicated concepts into leverage that you can use for your goals. So for me, my first personal trading certification I received when I was 18, and it was always my part-time job in college. So I worked at campus recreation at my university. And so when I got my bachelor's of science, I was pretty much training part-time and working at the gym in the free time that I had. I also did some health and fitness education while I was there for a peer group that was on campus. And surprisingly, I kind of detoured outside of that. So I did a couple competitions in college, but I was always told, you're not going to have a career as a fitness professional. It's going to be something you do in college, and then you need to go get a quote unquote real job. So that led me into the corporate world and saw even more, a lack of attention to health and fitness and well-being, and the experience of commuting to work and the stress that came along with a typical corporate experience, and decided to leverage that, and ultimately decided to start my company several years later, focusing on nutrition and training. I started kind of in a face-to-face capacity and then slowly moved online over time. So that's kind of my journey in a nutshell. There's some intricacies in there that led to different interests and passions and competitions along the way. But if I had to do like a 10,000 foot overview of my history, that would be where I would start.
Nice. Yeah, that's a pretty good elevator speech, I guess. I definitely like to kind of hear people's stories. Now, you talk a lot about your current company, which is actually called Oracle, which I love that name, by the way. And I read a little bit of the history of it, but can you tell my audience and people listening in a little bit about how that started, and why is it called Oracle, and what does it mean, and what does it entail?
So the reason I came up with the name Oracle, and part of this was through conversations with basically the clients that helped me start this business, because before that I was working as a contractor at a local gym, and I would work at a nutrition store on Sundays, also not my company. I was just a guy, trying to pay the bills, working for these other people. And as I started to have my own client base, I was like, what do I really stand for? And so for me, if you look at it in kind of a dictionary definition and not necessarily mythology or historical definition, an oracle is a reliable source of information or a trusted source of information. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the most difficult things about my fitness journey that led to being underweight or maybe not getting healthy the way that I should have the first time, or not dieting properly, or having maybe overtraining and doing things incorrectly, I didn't find, with the exception of maybe a few authors, there weren't very reliable, trusted sources of information. So I kind of took it upon myself to, while I couldn't have that impact at a national level at that point in my career, I decided, okay, well, for the 5 or 10 clients that I have, I'm going to inform them to the best of my abilities, and teaching, education, and that collaboration with my clients has always been a focal point of my business. And it's probably just because of my personality. I'm not the type of person that I don't just like to kind of look at the clock and say what time it is. I kind of like to know how the clock works. So I think because that was part of my journey, I naturally try to share that with clients. Like, this is this way because, as opposed to just giving them an answer and not explaining the rationale behind it. So that's kind of where Oracle came from, and why that name is important to me. So I wanted to encompass both the training and nutrition portion while also incorporating the educational component and the informational component that goes along with it.
Yeah, man. And it's really interesting because I was definitely reading about a lot about your website, and it definitely goes in line with kind of like my same vision with Viva Nutrition, and which is essentially an educational platform. And it's like the key to everything. Like it's trying to teach people the why. Because what I think it's, and I don't know if you see this all the time, and I feel like it gets worse by the day. Of course, there are really good things happening because of people like you, people like me, that are trying to educate. But there's a lot of people that are just not trying to go through the hassle of understanding the why, getting the education so they can make informed decisions. And that's the thing about coaching, that you're trying to kind of provide the tools, you provide the education, but then put the decision-making process on the person that you're coaching, instead of saying, hey, listen, like, this is what I need you to do. You do this and you're going to see results, because it's actually what it seems like what's being put out there a lot. And people are just kind of like looking for those results based on what that information is out there. So do you agree with that? Is that kind of like something that you kind of tend to see often with many people that come to you for coaching or for help?
Yeah, I think understanding is key. So you mentioned the why, and I see this in two areas. One is the why, as in the rationale for the program they're following. The other is the why as far as their intrinsic motivation, or what they think is their motivation for accomplishing their goals, can sometimes be distinctly different. There's kind of this disparity between what they think and reality. So as far as the why or the understanding, I definitely see, I'm following XYZ plan, or the, keto diet, or veganism, or intermittent fasting. I mean, I've literally had 2 or 3 people start with me in the last week that were doing some combination of multiple fad diets. So not just fasting, not just veganism, or not just ketogenic approach, but actually combining them and not really understanding the mechanisms of how they work, or why you would want to follow that sort of approach to begin with. So I definitely agree. I'm glad it's something you definitely take upon yourself, and I try to incorporate to my coaching practice as well. So I think there just needs to be enough vocalization, enough voices out there that are kind of explaining, hey, like, before you jump on this fad plan, like, you need to understand the why, or the mechanisms behind it.
Now, as a coach, do you ever like run into the not, I guess not going to call it problem, but the issue, or the challenge for many people, just with the lack of patience, and just wanting, like, because they come from this background of like, well, like the whole calories and how much I need to be eating and everything. I'm expecting to see a specific result. Like, do you see often like people coming to you with that same? Because it happens to me often, and sometimes it can be frustrating and to a certain extent. But is that kind of like a patience? Like, hey, like I'm not seeing results. Like, how do you deal with that? And kind of is that something that happens to you often with a lot of the people that come to you?
I think it's mixed. It depends on the personality type of the client, and also I think it depends on the coaching situation as well. I can definitely say I've been in that situation before. I've been in those shoes where a client is expecting something fairly rapid, and I try and be pretty transparent when I receive their intake forms and we're talking through things, even on their initial call. As of right now, I'm still doing mostly month-to-month coaching, so it's not like they sign up for a year and I have them. But to some degree, this is something I do struggle with, because there is a certain level of commitment relative to the expectation that's out there in the marketplace of fad diets and quick fixes and 30-minute workouts. And I think people look at me, and what I try and be transparent about is, I'm in pretty good shape, but I've been doing this since I was, over, I guess, 10 years now, of pretty much going to the gym the majority of the time, eating healthy the majority of the time, following some sort of structure the majority of the time, and having a coach for probably at least half of that, until I really truly grasped everything on my own. So I think it's probably one of the biggest pain points for coaches in the industry. And I think the struggle is you have to allow clients to make their own decision about whether they're in it for the long haul or whether they're looking for short-term instant gratification. But I always just try and use, like we said, the mechanisms and the why to explain, you made the decision to essentially diet this way for a very long time, or to not diet this way and be overweight, and to change this, here's what we need to do. I tend to have a lot of high achieving, kind of overdoing it type of people, like people who want to work out all the time and maybe are more prone to under eating, that tend to come to me. So a lot of times I have to reverse diet with them. So typically it's not the type of person that's lazy, which helps from a personality standpoint. It's just having the difficult conversation of, this might take more than 2 weeks, but I try and address that by, on our first call, they have to set a 12 to 16 week goal and then a 12-month goal. So we really don't look at anything shorter than a 12-week goal, which is helpful for me as a coach, because I at least have them looking out that far in terms of planning and what they're working towards, while also having some daily action steps.
Absolutely. I think it comes down to kind of setting the expectations properly from the beginning. And it happens to me also often into the fact that I tell them, like, hey, listen, like, I want you to start to think about this. Even if it may not take that long, look at it in the long term, look at the bigger picture. Say, for example, to yourself, this is something that is going to take me 6 to 12 months, when in fact, it may only take 3 or 4 for you to achieve the specific results that you're trying to achieve. But at least in your mind, you're kind of putting that you're putting that seed to say, essentially, like, oh, this is going to take me a little bit longer. So you're more focusing on the process rather than the outcome, which is, I think, it's something that is important. Now, I think you mentioned something important. I think it's a good time to kind of a good pivot point to jump into something that an interesting phrase and word that you mentioned, which is reverse dieting, because it's something that a lot of coaches have been talking about. And it's not something new, but it's definitely a term that is kind of gaining a lot of traction, which is essentially kind of like a way to start increasing calories gradually and strategically. Can you kind of develop more on what is really reverse dieting, when you actually get these people that are, for example, coming from a very low caloric intake, they're just not seeing results, and kind of how you deal with that and what's the process for it?
Sure. So what I like to do for reverse dieting is I'll take a 3 to 7 day food log, the more the better, or however long the client has tracked. I'll try and go back in their dietary history, and I'll compare the food log to an estimation of their total daily energy expenditure. And the larger the gap is between the food log and their total daily energy expenditure, it essentially gives you an indication of, here's what they're eating, they've stopped seeing progress, and they're maintaining their weight. So let's say they're eating 1,300 calories, but your calculation indicates that they should probably be eating closer to 2,000. The larger that spread, the more significant of a gap there is essentially between their current dietary protocol and where they would be for true maintenance, as opposed to what their body has maybe adapted to or become efficient at eating that amount of calories. So what happens is your body essentially downregulates to be able to function on the amount of calories that you are providing to it, and eventually will stop losing weight. So typically, you may have someone that's only 250 calories below. That's not that bad, but oftentimes you'll see people 500, 600, 700 calories below that estimated number that you would come to as a coach, just using typical basic math and energy calculations as far as for where their calorie balance would be. And so I will explain that to the client, ask a little bit about how they ended up here in the first place, what their method was for calorie subtraction. And then I typically take a very methodical approach to reverse dieting, which is just to first assess, okay, what type of diet are they on? Because they might be on a ketogenic diet, not eating any carbohydrates, and need to reverse diet, but they're not eating an entire food group, versus someone who is on kind of a balanced macronutrient ratio, and you just need to bring up their calories gradually. So the key distinction, though, for a reverse diet, It's interesting because I like the term reverse diet because you are kind of doing the opposite of subtracting calories in most cases. However, it kind of implies that it doesn't really, it's not indicative of the results that people may experience. I've had girls where they're getting ready for their wedding, they were eating too few calories, and then we added calories in and they actually lost weight. So those are hyper responders to a reverse diet. But basically it is kind of a recalibration phase is probably the best way to put it without thinking of addition and subtraction, just trying to recalibrate someone back to a healthy energy balance that's more sustainable for long-term health and body composition.
Now, do you experience a lot of resistance at the beginning, or I guess fear from, people? Because it's something actually I implement as well. And it's funny that you mentioned, some women that you worked with that you increase their calories and they start to see better results, and they're baffled. They're like, "How is this happening?" And I'm like, "Well, you're kind of putting your body into a state that it wants to change. You're fueling your body the way it's supposed to, not starving it." So, but did you experience a lot of resistance, like? And actually, I'm not going to say, I was going to say particularly women, but I think also in men, it's actually happening a lot on when you're telling them like, hey, listen, like we need to get your calories up. And a lot of people, they just kind of get, at least in my case, like they get super scared. Is that something that you kind of experience? And kind of how do you deal with that? Or how did you explain the client or your, the person in question, like why are you doing this the way you're doing it?
Right. So I think there is a huge fear around adding calories because the one thing you learn from day one in the health and fitness industry is, calories equal weight loss. So subtract, you learn the linear subtraction method of, 500 calories a day, 3,500 calories a week equals a pound of body fat, and just do that and chip away. Now, if you have a perfectly healthy metabolism, you've been eating in a surplus, or maybe you're eating at maintenance, yes, that calorie deficit and energy balance are the number one priority, assuming you're living in a vacuum and you have no previous adaptation or lower calorie diets in the past. But it still comes down to I kind of try and bring them back to the habits of, okay, why are you eating so low? And basically still staying in some sort of deficit usually is where you're starting the reverse diet, and just watching biofeedback and responses as they go. The way that I try and address the fear is say, okay, what positives can we focus on? So if you have this additional food, how well are you performing in your workouts? Are you setting PRs now that you actually have the energy to go in the gym and improve? And you'll have some people that are anomalies that are still getting stronger and setting PRs even with a total lack of food. But for the most part, as soon as you start to feed the body, whether it's CrossFit or traditional weightlifting, or, someone who maybe is running, generally there's an uptick in performance when you add the food, and then that creates a positive cycle. Generally they'll start sleeping better. So I'll take things outside of the cues related to calories and focus on PRs, focus on sleep, hunger, general mood. So I'll say, hey, are you in a better mood? How are you sleeping? And I'll try and shift our check-ins to really focus all on the positive things. So it's all about the perception and the lens of what the client is viewing as successful. And I think that's a huge key in effectively coaching a reverse diet. But I will admit there are tons of guys and girls that are fearful of it. Oftentimes, guys are going super low with those calories because they want to see abs and lose, stomach fat, or, because they've been overweight and they want to shed those pounds. Or for females, it's traditionally, they're educated that women should eat a lot less because they're women, but it's still subjective to individual metabolisms and their activity level. So definitely a lot of fear around it. And it takes some creative coaching to work on the mindset piece. I think it's probably the most difficult part of a reverse diet, or recalibrating someone from a nutritional standpoint, is working the mindset portion of that. So you can have the best strategy on paper for getting them out of the hole that they're in calorically, but if the mindset isn't in the right place, they won't buy into it. I mean, there are studies that show you can feed people 4 identical meals that are all isocaloric have the same nutritional value. But if you tell the person that one meal is healthier than the other, or they identify like their culture's food as healthier, even though it's literally the same thing, the people will actually have different internal health responses to the food, even though the macronutrients are exactly the same. So that's where the mindset piece comes in the reverse diet, because if someone thinks that they're going to get fatter or that adding calories is bad for them, the body is aware of that stress. So it sounds kind of woo-woo and crazy, but I think the body, like, there's a lot that goes on from a neurotransmitter standpoint and digestive standpoint and your stress inside the body, where I think your body can basically have a pulse of where those levels are when you're eating. So if you can get to a positive place of, okay, this reverse diet is good for my health, this is giving me fuel, I'm getting stronger in the gym, I will sleep better because I won't wake up in the middle of the night hungry, I'm more pleasant to be around because I have more energy, and vitality, those are all things that can go a long way in improving the effectiveness of the reverse diet.
Yeah. And it's literally putting and kind of putting it into perspective for them to say, like, hey, look, like maybe the weight on the scale is not moving, but make the list of all the great positives that you had this week. And I get that on my check-ins all the time. And then, all this list of things such as, my energy in the gym is much better. I'm sleeping better. People that are becoming more regular going to the bathroom because they had some constipation issues. The list goes on. And then but the weight is an issue and they're just so frustrated. And I say, listen, like, look at all these different things. Like, you're feeling amazing. All these things are happening, but you're still focused on the one thing that has always been your kind of like the thing that makes you upset, like, that frustrates you the most. So it's obviously kind of changing that mentality. I just kind of call that mindset resistance. It's just essentially, it's like you're saying, like, and I totally agree with you. And it is woo-woo, but it's really how it works. When you're in a mindset of positivity and, like, I'm going to accept what's happening, I'm going to trust the process, like, everything usually falls into place. So I think that's definitely something that we just kind of, as coaches, and for you guys listening in, like, you kind of have to be patient through that and understand that, it's all the aspects of nutrition. It's not just, the number on the scale per se. So I think that's definitely something important to cover. Now, Sam, let's kind of nerd out a little bit more and dive deep into, like, the physiology and specifically on reverse dieting and people that are starting off, because you talked a lot earlier about, like, the bigger gap from, like, the total energy expenditure for you guys listening in. That's essentially the amount of calories your body needs after accounting exercise and activity and all these different things. So you talked a lot about the gap when somebody is, like, at a very low calorie intake. What's happening, like, hormonally? Because I know, like, in social media, you're kind of known as the expert in hormone optimization and those kinds of things. So I definitely would like to get your input on what is happening hormonally. Like, why is people, not really seeing those results when they're trying to, like, lower the calories even more and exercise more? Like, what's happening inside the body from the hormonal perspective?
Sure. So your HPTA axis is basically a survival mechanism. What that acronym stands for is your hypothalamus and your pituitary gland. In females, you have your adrenals. In males, you have your adrenals, hypothalamus, pituitary, and then also your testicles essentially serve as the last part of that. And you're probably wondering, like, how does reproductive function or organs play into metabolism? And it's actually pretty crazy. We even have thyroid receptor cells in the male reproductive organs. So it's really in Leydig cells that essentially are super sensitive to male hormone production, So that's just kind of the bigger picture, the name of it. Just kind of wanted to break that down for you guys quickly. To make this very, very, very simple, just think of our bodies essentially were designed to make sure that we have enough food to survive, that we're not under stress. Any indication of stress or threat to reproduction or survival, our bodies will basically make ourselves more efficient to accomplish our daily tasks. Layne Norton actually talks about this a lot. When you have someone in a diet phase, you'll notice that your non-exercise related activity levels will go down. So you'll stop twitching quite as much. Your eyes will blink slower. If you actually record someone for a minute and watch them talking like in a calorie surplus versus in a calorie deficit, your basically movement and energy that you're not paying attention to will decline. This is partially a survival mechanism. You'll be more prone to sit around and less likely to kind of get up and have bouncing energy. This is partially your thyroid and conserving energy expenditure. And you'll also get a down regulation in testosterone production in males, because why do you need to reproduce if there's not enough food around? It just doesn't make sense logically. So you'll lower testosterone, which is a primary driver of libido and sex drive, which would drive kind of reproductive function. And that's how our body slowly begins to bring in the reins. It says, okay, if you're not giving me 2,000 calories of energy, you're giving me 1,300. How do I close this gap? And so some people call this metabolic adaptation or metabolic insufficiency, adrenal insufficiency. But what's really happening is your body's just communicating in multiple ways to basically draw a line saying, okay, we're under stress, because we know that activity level, if too much or too little, can be stress on the body. We know that eating too much or too little can be stress on the body. And our hypothalamus and our pituitary are very sensitive to that. So the nerding out portion of reverse dieting is essentially you're having responses from thyroid, kind of this master governing metabolic hormones. You're having testosterone downregulation in males. You'll likely have changes in hormonal cycles and 28-day menstrual cycles for females, because it doesn't make sense to carry a baby to term if you're likely to have a miscarriage from not having enough food, or if you're not going to be able to feed the baby when the baby is born. The way I try and explain it to clients is your body doesn't know that there's a refrigerator 50 feet from you or down the hall from your office. It simply knows what you're feeding it and the perceived stress and its attempt to regulate energy as efficiently as possible. That's what our body does. So the kind of main takeaways from that science is that by feeding your body strategic nutrients at specific times, or making sure you're in calorie balance for the week, you can lessen that stress on their body. So for someone who's overeating, you can reduce hormonal stress and improve pancreatic health, insulin, testosterone, estrogen levels in males simply by losing body fat. For someone who's under eating, you can improve hormonal health simply by improving your habits, by eating a proper amount, maybe getting your training back in alignment where you're not overtraining, it's properly periodized for your goals. And that's where really, even these most complicated, nerdy concepts still come back to habits. So that's kind of my breakdown of how a reverse diet or under eating can impact your hormones. When you slowly start to add that food back in, you have insulin, which will be coming back into the body as you ingest carbohydrates. That's counter-regulatory to cortisol, which is a stress hormone. So you begin to lower that through eating carbohydrates, having amino acids from proteins, and your body starts to heal basically from the inside out. So that would be kind of my overview. If you have, any specific.
No, that's great. That's kind of like a good summary of like what kind of everything is happening. Now let's talk a little bit about cortisol, because I get a lot of people asking me about kind of cortisol changes, because from what I understand, cortisol is kind of like a hormone that goes in waves throughout the day, but also it's kind of a lot related to things like, for example, stress. And a lot of times it gets physiological stress due to under eating and things like that. So what is like cortisol's specific role in the body, and how do, I guess, like during caloric restrictions, periods of time, or sometimes during stress, like how are those levels usually fluctuate? Do they usually go up, and what does that really entail? Like, is it more like fat production, or more fat? I guess like you're storing more fat more so than anything else, or what's really happening when cortisol levels are not optimal?
Right. So this really lends itself to a full view of circadian rhythm, because what's happening when you're not eating enough is more so you'll have elevated cortisol levels, which will inhibit sleep, because cortisol should not be high in the evening. Naturally, cortisol is good in the morning or around your workouts. If you work out earlier in the day, you do want a cortisol release. In fact, without cortisol, we would have a hard time doing our day-to-day activities. You need cortisol in your circadian rhythm. It's all about the balance. What tends to happen is when cortisol is elevated in the evening and it impacts our melatonin production, which is kind of like if you were to have a race of whether it's people horses, whatever, and you have the guy at the beginning of the race that fires the gun that tells everybody to run. That's what melatonin does. It basically is our launch or kickstart into the sleep process, even though it's not deeply involved in like further on in sleep. But what happens when we're not eating enough, or we're getting hungry in the middle of the night, or cortisol is elevated in the evening, it's impacting leptin and ghrelin secretion, which then impact appetite and fat loss, and kind of create this vicious cycle. So under eating really isn't just about the calorie balance anymore. It's about, you mentioned sometimes people have the unwanted fat gain. That's not necessarily solely from the cortisol. It's probably because in males, cortisol is inversely related to testosterone. Estrogen, usually we have more of the aromatase enzyme that converts testosterone to estrogen in our fat cells. So as we begin to have more fat, or we're holding on to things, or cortisol is impacting our hormonal balance, we just slowly but surely start to have these negative changes that start to stack up and have a domino effect impacting our body composition. So it's not any one thing, it's the whole system together. But reverse dieting, carbohydrates and making sure you're blunting cortisol allows you to have proper amounts of serotonin in the evening, which helps you sleep. If you're sleeping better, you're going to have better insulin sensitivity. If you have better insulin sensitivity and you wake up in the morning and have good fasted blood glucose levels, then we can begin to add more carbohydrates. And now you're turning on basically this machine and positive cycle in your body. So think of it as you have one cycle that's moving clockwise. This would be the reverse diet, feeding hormonal health, feeding sleep and positive adaptation. And then you have the counterclockwise circle, which is someone who's in a drastic deficit and moving opposite of the current, trying to fight every single thing that they can, poor sleep quality, overtraining, undereating, continuing to subtract calories, and really there's a dead end there, or you just continue to negatively impact your health. So it's really a whole cascade from cortisol to everything else. But just as a quick breakdown for the listeners, because I know this can get very complicated, circadian rhythm or cortisol, melatonin balance, all of these hormones we're talking about, it's very simply just a biological clock or schedule that your body likes to release hormones, regenerate organs, and do things at a certain time. So everything from the foods we eat to our light exposure, our eyes and our optic nerves have a sensory portion to them that registers light exposure, and that impacts melatonin and cortisol as well. So they're basically all of these functions that kind of work in tandem. But when one of them is really out of whack, like cortisol, it starts to negatively impact all of these other behaviors and start to, have negative effects in the body.
Okay, makes sense. And now piggybacking on that part of circadian rhythm, because it's definitely something that I like to talk a lot about. I recently had a podcast with, she's a nurse practitioner. Her name is Joanne Keller. She's a great friend. And she also works a lot with hormone optimization. And we talked a little bit about cortisol and the wave that goes throughout the day. And you guys kind of like are in line and everything you said. But one of the things that she also mentioned was like optimal training times. And she was talking a little bit about higher cortisol. Usually cortisol levels start to kind of drop in the, usually around nighttime. So she was kind of talking about the idea that it's not the optimal time for training or for exercise, but you're kind of spiking, especially for like high intensity type of training. What are your thoughts on that?
So if someone asked me, and I had to answer this for my clients, really the best time to exercise is when you're able to consistently get it in. But I would say that if you're working out so late that it's negatively impacting your sleep, sleep is king. I mean, slow wave sleep in males is linked to improved testosterone levels, which essentially allow you to have better body composition with less effort relative to, if you don't have adequate androgens in a male or like in a female, if working out late at night disturbs your sleep and that impacts your menstrual cycle, then we're having negative health consequences from it. So I'm definitely a fan of not working out within a couple hours of bedtime. But if someone can't work out at 7 a.m. or 9 a.m. and they can only work out at 5 p.m., I would encourage them to work out. We just may change some things like caffeine intake, or where we might front load hydration so that they're not up all night getting up and making trips to the bathroom. Just little tiny tweaks that can try to mitigate the damage. But in a vacuum with our society, many people work like 8 to 6, 9 to 5, 8 to 5, with a lunch break. So unless you can work out on your lunch break or before work, some people have children and, they work out while kids are in school or something, but it's very much based on the client and the individual. Some people can go work out and pass out and get a great night's sleep. Personally, I tend to gravitate towards either morning, mid-morning, or early afternoon workouts tend to be the best for me. Anything kind of after 3 or 4 p.m. Just feels odd to me. I don't really have as good of a training session. So my personal preference, just for me as an individual, I work from home on most days, or I'm in an office environment, and I can structure my schedule where I can train. But for my clients, it's usually, how do we get this in and fit this around your work schedule, your life, your family, any obligations that you have.
Okay, that's nice. Yeah, I think I'm on the same boat with you, because I feel like, if you're not going to tell somebody like, well, if you can't work out in the morning because your cortisol levels are going to be too spiked up at nighttime, then just don't work out at all. Of course, it's not the right kind of approach. I just kind of wanted to get kind of like your input on that, because I feel like it's something that's been talked about. But I definitely agree that I don't think you have to completely sacrifice your workouts at night simply because you're going to spike up your cortisol levels at that time. As long as we kind of take care of those other things.
Yeah, and there are things you can do, like getting back in a parasympathetic state, foam rolling, stretching. There are supplements that you can utilize. Ingesting carbohydrates post-workout will help to put you back in a parasympathetic state, which is basically rest and digest, which would help you then wind down for sleep, as opposed to just rolling out of the gym and trying to walk straight into your bedroom. So there's a lot that you can do to regulate that nervous system activity and make sure that you're primed for sleep. If you are going to work out in the evening, definitely having a cool, like a wind down where maybe it's foam rolling or stretching or breathing, or, getting and then ingesting adequate nutrients, and still having a preparatory phase before sleep. If I had someone with a very unhealthy circadian rhythm, unhealthy cortisol levels, hormonal problems, and they had a flexible schedule, I would likely move the training earlier in the day. But that's just personal preference. Yeah. And it may only be realistic if they're able to prioritize their health to that extent. But otherwise, I think as a coach, you just have to mitigate the damage if they're working out after work, make sure their nutritional strategies are in line to support, healthy neurotransmitter function, circadian rhythm, adequate sleep. It may involve tapering caffeine and also having potentially something to help induce sleep at a normal time, so they're not staying up super late.
Yeah, I agree. I think, and I also sometimes kind of incorporate some things like you mentioned, like foam rolling and things like that. So anything that, for example, would try to block, like I'm a big fan of blocking blue light, or trying to reduce exposure to, for example, screens, or so for example, like at nighttime, I try to wear myself, because I am on my phone still like up until like 9 or 9:30. That's usually my cutoff time. But I'm still trying to either wear blue light blocking glasses, like the legit ones, trying to kind of block that light, because, from my understanding and some of the research I've seen is like, melatonin production we were talking about earlier, it's usually disrupted because like kind of like those receptors in the eyes are essentially capturing that light from screens and things like that as it's still daylight, and it's not kind of entering in that what you call that parasympathetic state, in which you kind of like you're resting, relaxing, getting ready for bed, getting ready for kind of like the recovery process of the body, and it's just trying to optimize ways or find ways that you can that you can kind of work in sync with the body. Does that make sense? I think that's definitely one of the things that I feel like a lot of people sometimes just look at nutrition and just training and not really think about everything else that is affected by it.
Right. It's a very large puzzle. So I think you hit the nail on the head. It's looking at everything that's affected by it is it's very important to have a cohesive strategy for everything, because if the training doesn't match the nutrition, if the lifestyle doesn't match the training, it can really cause a lot of problems and lead to frustrations for clients, or, if you're following a routine on your own and trying to piece this together, really try and match things up as best you can. Otherwise, it's going to feel like you're spinning your wheels.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I wanted to kind of switch back into a different kind of topic within the same kind of realm of everything as far as calories, just to kind of wrap up in the last few minutes that we have in our conversation today, Sam, which is actually talking about weight gain and the now changing the spectrum of things to those individuals that are trying to put on muscle mass. Because I'm curious on your thoughts on hormonally, what's happening when now you're not talking about putting the body on a lot of like a very low calorie stress, but now maybe putting it in a very high calorie stress. Because I see a lot of guys, for example, a lot of my audiences and people listening in, they're guys trying to maximize their ability to put on mass. And I think a lot of times like they just go by the idea, like I just need to be in a caloric surplus. I just need to eat. But I'm just curious on your thoughts on what's happening in the body from the hormonal perspective. Is this something similar to what's happening when you're at a very low calorie intake? Or it's usually something that is more in line of the way that the body's supposed to be working?
Good question. So, I don't know that I think we can handle a surplus. Our body definitely has mechanisms. We turn on other gene, like there's other gene expression when we are in a calorie surplus. But oftentimes I feel like people who are truly trying to quote unquote bulk or have, even if it's lean gains and they're in a surplus, a lot of times they'll go too high, too fast, as opposed to maximizing lean gains at, let's add 100 or 200 calories and tier. I really like using kind of a stair step approach. So you might go up, stay at that level of calories for a little bit, see how the body responds, and then go up again. Or maybe you need to do kind of the opposite of what a Matador protocol would be in weight loss, which is that's where you do like 2 on, 2 off deficit and maintenance. You can preserve insulin sensitivity in a lean gains phase by doing kind of a zigzag, like 2 to 4 weeks in a surplus, kind of hold that maintenance for a little bit, make sure your digestion is working. Because one of the biggest things I see is folks eating in a surplus and not prioritizing digestion. And if you can't digest the food, you're not going to assimilate it and build new muscle tissue. Or if you lose all of your insulin sensitivity, you're not sensitive to carbohydrates, you're now, over ingesting carbohydrates, and you're more likely to put on body fat. So I think you need to still look at things like those blood markers of, okay, am I in a good place with my fasted blood glucose? Am I in a good place? As far as you may want to monitor scale weight or tape measurements, body composition, things like that over time. So I'm more of a believer. I think if you're very, very young, like high school, college athletes, they just need to eat. And a surplus would be great for them because they're likely growing, super active. It'd be better to err on the side of overeating than undereating with younger athletes, because you definitely, there's an injury risk involved, whether that's athletics, bodybuilding, really anything. They have the potential to grow and just have a different response than we do. I think for older males and even females, but it's more common to have a guy come to you who wants to bulk up. So I'm going to roll with that example. Typically with older males, I find that you can do really well with a great training program and recomposition just slightly above maintenance calories, and being very mindful of your carbohydrates and eating high quality foods, and maybe occasionally for digestion, having not regular intermittent fasting, but maybe on a weekend, you allow your gut to have a little bit of a break, maybe on a non-training day or a recovery day, just something to prevent your body from having a lot of gastrointestinal distress, which can happen if you're pounding food. Some people call it like power shoveling when they're bulking, but I know both Ben Pack, Charles Poliquin, Cody Boom Boom talks about this a lot in terms of having kind of either a adjusted intermittent fast on one day or kind of a longer period. John Meadows also does periodic, like 24-hour fasts when traveling. So a lot of these guys that are still more aesthetics and body composition minded and coaching larger individuals are realizing the need for gut health, mitochondrial health, to have periodic breaks in digestion. Because if you're eating, 2-3 hours or every 4 hours meals that are in a surplus, you can end up with some negative consequences from that if you're constantly trying to digest food. So you really want to figure out an optimal amount and stick with that. And note that I didn't say fasting every day. It was just like strategically implementing it for gut health, longevity, and GI distress.
Yeah, I think I'm a big fan of fasting methods and strategic ones, like you mentioned, because of all the reasons that you mentioned about earlier on, from mitochondrial health and longevity. So I definitely think it's something that a lot of not only coaches, but also people listening in, that it's also important to consider. The thing is, it's important to have a strategy for it and to be able to really structure it in a way that is working, for you, not against you. So I think that's something like that is really interesting to kind of think about. Now, and the last question I also have for you, Sam, was, as far as like when you look at it like at a macro level, for example, for an entire year, what do you think is like a safe like time, I guess like timeline where people can be on a caloric deficit without starting to, let's say, for example, and I'm not going to go too in depth into like physique athletes or anything like that, because I don't want to, that could be an entire conversation in and itself, but more of, how long can somebody safely stay on a caloric deficit without actually kind of hurting themselves? And when is a good time to maybe take like a little diet break and say, let's bring you back up for a little while, and then we can start kind of like bringing things down again?
So it really depends on the person and their biofeedback. And I know people hate that answer. It depends, but nutrition should be individualized. Most people, I would say 12 to 16 weeks. But if you have negative, if you're starting to have sleep disturbances, if you're cranky, hungry, if you're having a lot of problems with it, it's okay to pull back on the calorie deficit. Some people can go longer, 20 weeks, 24 weeks. But, hopefully if you are an athlete, get periodic lab work or blood work done to make sure your internal health is still good. If you're not an athlete and you have a coach, and you're just a lifestyle client, like monitor your biofeedback, make sure you're sleeping. Are you still progressing with your diet? If things start to stall out, you may want a diet break or reverse diet. And that can really help to reset and recalibrate things. So, I'm definitely a firm believer that the range would depend on the state of the individual when they're coming to you in a diet. So let's say they were in a deficit for 8 weeks trying to diet before they hired you. We probably don't want to go a full 16 weeks, but it definitely varies person to person. Some people are very resilient to a calorie deficit and can continue to lose weight in a calorie deficit. Other people have very sensitive endocrine systems. You don't really know that until you start to work with someone. So that's where communication, check-ins, and asking the appropriate questions can really go a long way. But if I had to have a general range, I'd say 12 to 16 weeks. For those of you who are kind of in a competitive realm or physique athletes, there's a study on the hormonal changes that Andrew Purdue did at UNC, which was basically there are transient changes to thyroid hormone, testosterone levels over a natural bodybuilding competition prep. Obviously, it becomes different when there are other substances involved, but for the most part, like even during that time frame of just a regular contest prep, you do start to see hormonal decline, and that's why diet breaks and reverse dieting are really important.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think that's important, and like you said from the beginning, it's the answer that nobody wants to hear, but it's the answer that it truly is. Like it's all personalized, so it really depends on where you're coming from and where you're starting. So I think that's very valuable to understand. Well, we're coming up to the end of today's episode, Sam. But before that, I always like to do a few what I call rapid fire questions. And I usually say this all the time, but I stole that from Tim Ferriss. So it's usually, quick answers to specific questions that are just a little bit of fun so people can find out more about you. You ready for him?
I'm trying, man. All right, I'm ready.
All right. So first question goes, if you can pick one exercise that you can do forever or that you can do for the rest of your life that you absolutely love, what would that be and why?
I hate this question. Those caveats that get you, man. Oh, maybe either like a hex bar deadlift, because if I have to do it forever and I'm going to be old, it works. It's everything. Or like some sort of pull, like a sternum chin up or something like that. Something that really incorporates, if I could do more gymnastics on rings. I would say rings, but I'm not quite the gymnast. So I'll go. Yeah, I'll stick with my original, maybe like a hex bar deadlift or something.
That's a good one. That's exactly what I would have picked. Some sort of deadlift. I think it's just more of like a functional type of movement. So it hits kind of like all areas. Last week, I actually had a podcast with a sports dietitian who picked exactly the same thing, the hex bar deadlift. Great.
I think that's Ben Bruno has that answer too. But there's so many questions.
Okay, nice. I think it's a good one for sure. Let's go on to the next one, which would be any kind of podcast that you would recommend somebody to listen to like right now.
All the episodes on this podcast.
Awesome. Appreciate that.
So I really enjoy, if you're more on the sciencey side as a coach, I like the Muscle Expert podcast. I think it's really good. If you are a client or a follower and want something that's maybe not quite at the level of other nutrition coaches, I'm a big fan of the Boom Boom Performance podcast that Cody has. And I was on there as well. I think it's episode 204 talking about hormones and stuff where we break things down. So those are great nice. Entry points. So for people looking to get more.
Yeah, Cody's actually coming on to my podcast, I think next week, and we're going to talk about some cool things as well. I know he's big into like this entire coaching world and optimization of nutrition and fitness. So I'm excited to see what he has to say. All right, so let's move on to the other one, which is any books that you would recommend for somebody to immediately pick up from a bookstore. It could be anything. It could be, business. It could be personal growth or nutrition, fitness, anything.
So right now I'm reading The Big Leap. It's been pretty good so far. I read The Third Circle Theory by Pejman Gandhi. I think I always mess up his name. He goes by like PJ. But it's called The Third Circle Theory. And I think if you're a business owner or like aspiring entrepreneur or just general high achiever, I think it's a very interesting concept to kind of zoom out from the world and view things on paper and get a renewed perspective. Super fascinating. It's kind of, what was that movie, Inception or? Yeah,
with was it DiCaprio or Brett? I forgot. I think
it's a nonfiction book. It's not a fictional story, but what's cool about it is it really requires you to zoom out and think about life in a different lens. Like, why am I the way that I am? Like, how was I brought up? Why do I have the thoughts and
what is it called again?
It's called Third Circle Theory.
Third Circle Theory.
A photo or
Yeah. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna find it or if you can send it to me so I can add it to the show notes. Some people can directly go and check it out if they want to read it. So awesome. All right, last question, and this is the funnest one. Would be if you were stranded on an island for another rest of your life type of question, and you could pick one food that you can live off for, like I said, the entire rest of your life stranded on an island, what would that be? And I've heard all kinds of crazy things, dude.
Grass-fed filet mignon.
Okay, that's a good one. I think somebody else at some point said steak, so I think it's a good one. But I've heard things from like, I don't know if you know Justin Murphy. He said, "I'll have a poke bowl," and I'm like, okay, that's an interesting one. So I always kind of like.
Yeah, I was worried. I was like, "Oof, I'm not going to have any vegetables, but maybe there's some plants on the island." To be honest, the first thing I thought is like, well, if I'm stuck here, can I at least like have my dog to hang out with me? But
yeah, trying to kind of keep yourself a little, with company. That's definitely something important. Cool, man. So, we're coming up to the end of today's podcast. Like, how can people find out more about you, what you do? How can people reach out to you if they wanted to contact you or, get in touch?
Sure. So our company website is oraclefitness.com. So that's ORACLE fitness.com. And we have a featured content page. I will likely throw this up on there as well, which will link directly to iTunes, other podcasts, articles on T Nation, In3 Nutrition's blog, Boom Boom Performance, Tiger Fitness. There's a whole host of free content on there. So that's a great way to read more, learn more. You can also contact me through that website. I'm also on Instagram, post stories fairly frequently. Our company page is Oracle_coaching, and my personal page is Sam Miller Science, all one word. And we're fairly active on there. And there's a whole host of educational videos on our Facebook page as well, if you're interested in just gathering, free content, learning more about these concepts.
Absolutely. So I'm going to go ahead and put all those links to Sam's website and then his Instagram, both his coaching business and also his personal Instagram also on there, to make sure you guys can check him out and visit his page and reach out to him if you have questions. Like I said, Sam is a huge expert on hormones, and he can kind of go and geek out a little bit more into this kinds of topics, because we kind of talk about this on an overview. So literally we can have an entire hour podcast on each specific hormone and what happens in the body throughout different stages. But we just kind of wanted to give you guys a kind of overview from that perspective. And hopefully we were able to kind of get that objective across. So Sam, it was a pleasure to have you here today, man. Let's do this again soon in the future. I really hope to get you back on here to talk and chat more a little bit about other topics within the nutrition and fitness world. How do you say?
Thanks, man. I would love that. I appreciate you having me today. And to all the listeners, thanks for taking the time to listen to us for an hour, and always reach out if you have questions. Happy to help.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for tuning in another episode of Viva Nutrition Radio. I'll see you guys on the next one. You have been listening to Viva Nutrition Radio. Couple of things before you take off. If you enjoyed this episode, please, I would love to get your feedback. So feel free to drop down a review, and I will be forever grateful. Also, if you like this podcast, make sure you hit the subscribe button. We have it on iTunes, Spotify, or Google Play. And lastly, if you would like to receive a freebie from me, make sure you sign up for our newsletter at www.vive-nutrition.com. See you guys in the next episode. Ciao, ciao.